Our mission, and we choose to accept it, is zero injuries and zero environmental impact. A healthy workforce and environment is key to our nation's continued success. The Mission Zero podcast is a deep dive with the industry's top experts into the health, safety, and environmental aspects of today's workplace. Our mission is to be a platform for new ideas and strategies that, when implemented, will improve our safety, our environment, and how we govern out business. We are making the world safer, and we're going to have fun doing it.
Okay, everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Mission Zero podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Peoples. Today, my guest is Nina Spencer from Onward, Inc. We've got a lot to talk about. Nina, we've known each other for a couple of months now, so we've got a lot to talk about. Thank you for coming and being a guest. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. We like to start the podcast out. Of course, we want to get into the nitty gritty of why you're here, and of course, it's in the world of safety. But first, we'd like to know a little bit about you, as the audience will hear soon. Nina is not a native-born American; she comes from across the pond. So, Nina, tell us a little bit about your life, where you're from, and how you got to this point in life.
Yeah, so I'm from sunny Scotland, originally. I'm going to offend a lot of people and say that I don't claim Aberdeen as home, that Edinburgh is home, even though I did spend some of my early years in Aberdeen. But yeah, I came over to the US, actually. I did my university in Edinburgh at Heriot-Watt. I did business law, so all of my education was done back home. And then there's a great foundation called the Saltire Foundation that works with the Scottish government and gives students, not necessarily, as we know, not all the A grade students, but students that have, a particular passion for business or some sort of kind of department, and it gives them the opportunity to go overseas and work for a while with a different company. And I was chosen by Wood, the old Wood Group.
Okay.
And I came to Houston in 2009, so that was the penultimate year of my degree, and came to Houston, worked with some great guys in Wood, really got a taste for oil and gas, and they helped me kind of shape my dissertation for my last year for my master's. And I did it on corporate social responsibility within the oil and gas sector, right before Deepwater Horizon happened in 2010. And then in 2010, I ended up coming back to Houston once I finished my degree and working for a very Texas company called West Engineering that was certifying BOPs. So I didn't really know that much about offshore industry per se, but my first kind of paid job, if you like, in Houston was working for a company that was incredibly active, working on regulations, figuring out the new SEMS regulations, the new BOP regulations for after Macondo, the Deepwater incident. So I was incredibly lucky, and I got to hit the ground running at, 2010 was such a pivotal time for Gulf of Mexico. And my kind of background and interest is this mixture between law, like I enjoy it, but I don't have that necessarily like that legal brain, but I like the business side of it. And so it was really interesting to me on how they were bringing in regulations and how it was affecting the change of the Gulf of Mexico, which at the time I knew very little about. So, and then from then I've worked in various different, companies and sectors, but all offshore. So I did a stint in Trinidad. I did a stint in South Korea, bringing out some drill ships. But it's all been really kind of tied in some way to regulations, health and safety, and and then 14 years later, I'm still in Gulf of Mexico working on health and safety and oil and gas. Being from Bonnie, Scotland. So I know it's sometimes bonny,
Yeah.
but on nice sunny days, it's bonny.
I've seen it at its worst, and I've seen it at its best.
That's great.
I like the sunny days because the best view in all of Scotland is the north, when they cut the fields and they're that gold color. All of it's gold and the bales of hay are out there, and if the sun comes out, it's like the entire place is made of gold. It's the most beautiful.
I was gonna say you're being very poetic, Jeff. I would have been like, "Oh, it's sitting on a picnic blanket in the meadows with a cold beer in your hand."
It is. I mean, you could have a beer with this, but man, the view of it. But the only problem I've had is from my first visits there till more recently is, I'll offend a lot of people, but the windmills have ruined the view in a lot of places, in my opinion.
Oh, it
But
has, yeah.
it is just not the same upper, Highland area as it used to be, and it's just it kind of litters the whole entire country almost now, and it's just it ruins the view a little bit. But okay, so you started out in 2010 with an onshore company, not an offshore company.
So they were offshore, but they were certifying blowout preventers subsea. And so it was that's where all the regulations from Deepwater Horizon came, and that was the kind of this pinnacle moment in the Gulf of Mexico when we went from, I say we, and I wasn't in Gulf of Mexico, compared to Scotland, what we know in the North Sea being a highly regulated safety case industry, to then when I came into the Gulf of Mexico, a not
Wild
so
West.
highly regulated. And the Scotland and the UK, we have a completely different culture in regards to how we view government. Rightly or wrongly, this probably is not the right podcast to get into it. Um,
It is the right podcast. Go right ahead.
but the UK is highly regulated in everything.
Mhm.
And, we look to the government, and there is a historical trust. And the US is not based on that foundation. And so when you had an incident like Deepwater Horizon, and then there was this flood of new regulations where you had this memorandum, nobody was allowed to drill, everybody has to sit down until we can figure out these regulations. Um, you know, I, I think of myself as incredibly blessed to come in at such an interesting
Perfect time.
time. And I'm learning, like I didn't know anything.
Well, I feel like everybody would have been though.
So yeah, so everybody was learning. And I did a lot of energy um based classes in university that were based on UK regulations. And, we can disagree or agree, but a lot of the regulations, of course, they're going to look to the North Sea. They're very different. They're written in a very different way, but there is a basis. There's a basis there that I understood. Um, but obviously that offshore aspect I didn't have a clue about. And I think I've done my career backwards. I now probably spend more time offshore as you're meant to start getting more perks and spending more time in the office. I've gone the other way, and I've ended up spending more time as my career progresses offshore.
Yeah, I was once on the HSE committee for PISA. It's now called the Energy Workforce Council, but it was PISA. They had a couple of people, well, a few people on there who were the safety managers for, I think, particular Schlumberger and a couple other companies for the offshore. And I mean, my head would spin when they started talking about the offshore regulations and how often they changed. Things were changing for them monthly almost, as far as percentages of this chemical and that kind of very micro details of what they have to go through and make sure they're properly doing things properly in the water. But yeah, the I believe, of course, we see it as all of Europe being at least a generation ahead of us, or I don't know if it's called positive, but at least a generation ahead in safety, and certainly of environmental side of regulating the oil and gas industry. So I'm sure coming from the offshore in Scotland, it's got to be. I think anyone would have a little bit of a shock coming to the Gulf of Mexico and saying, okay, well, maybe it'll help. But to me, that would make a person coming from those areas valuable because, in my opinion, my humble opinion, the answer is probably somewhere in between Scotland and the Gulf of Mexico. And the people from Scotland that have the knowledge of that know these regulations and how things work there could bring the Gulf of Mexico up a little bit to meet those. And I think that's probably what would make you valuable, or anyone from Scotland, really.
Yeah, and I think, the Gulf and America in general were not so bureaucratic in the US. And so there's that freedom, and that freedom of less red tape and more driven towards the business side of it can actually be beneficial for health and safety, because you're more flexible, you're more willing to change, you're more willing to look at it. I will say, I think that I was given a lot more opportunities in Houston, in the Gulf of Mexico, in the US as a very young, I mean, I'm still obviously very, very young. We're not going to discuss ages, but as a young female, because that kind of American dream mentality, they allow you to be tested. Um, Texas is a right to work state, so they'll fire you if you fail, but they give you the opportunity to try. And I will say I worked for some great people and some great companies where if I showed an interest in something, they were like, yeah, sure, come with me or do that. Or even when I first went and did water survival, I said, oh, that's kind of sounds like a cool thing to do, which now I probably hadn't. And I had really no intention of going offshore at the time. And they said, yeah, go do it. Um, and I said, hey, if you ever want to, if you ever have a seat in a helicopter and, would be interested in letting me go offshore. And, oh yeah, absolutely, no problem. And I don't know that would have happened in the North Sea. I think I was given a lot of those opportunities because of the culture in the US, and they were like, yeah, go ahead. And that's how you develop people. That's how you get good people. And good people have a tendency to be safe people. And in the Gulf of Mexico, particularly, like we need we need we need good people. We need good people everywhere, but we need good people in the Gulf of Mexico because, especially after the economy right now, we're hurting, we're competing, and there's this really strong correlation between good people and people that work safely.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I told people, since I've never worked directly in oil and gas. I've only provided products to oil and gas. But what I've learned in a short time is that the companies that care, there is a strong correlation between the companies that care about safety and how well they do financially. The companies that I would go to and have discussions with, and like, showed, a disinterest in trying to up their safety game and trying to protect their people, they're usually out of business in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah,
It's just, it really works that way. And I like what you said before about the U.S. versus, there's also obviously pros and cons.
sure.
And, the way I used to describe it to people is that the U.S. Doesn't give you much as Europe does, but it allows you much more. And, the European countries will give you a great ground to step on. They'll take care of you, but you're limited in your upward mobility in life and what you could do a little bit there. And so, yeah, I think the opportunity here is more, but you're given less. It depends what kind of person you are, really, is how you would thrive in the US. But I'm glad to hear you are. But let's get to, I guess, modern. You're currently with Onward Inc. Onward Inc. has a couple of different faces, and you're more. Well, actually, I'll let you tell it.
So it started as a kind of safety, human factors, culture company back in 2010 when I was not with the company. And it's moved into different areas, and we have a lot of safety consultants, employees that work directly on long-term projects for operators and service providers and drilling contractors and those types of customers. And we provide a lot of kind of in-house HSE safety regulatory support. When I was working a lot in-house for operators, operators are required every 3 years to be audited by a third party. And I would help a lot of those operators either get ready for their audits, I would help them during their audits. I would help them with their corrective actions after their audits and kind of everything in between. And I saw a wee bit of a gap in the market where there was also a need to provide qualified auditors. And so here very recently, Onward has become one of the very few, I believe there's only 5, um, allowed auditors to audit operators in the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay, so 5 total companies.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, there's not a lot of operators in the Gulf of Mexico, and they all have to be audited every 3 years. And, there's a whole bunch of regulations that go with it. But it was important for me, even though it was an absolute bear, and I probably shouldn't say that. Actually, can we probably delete that bit in case they're listening? But it was a bit of a bear to get the certification. And halfway through, I thought, oh, I don't know if this was worth it or if this is the right thing. But I think it's like anything. It's also important. It's also important to be able to tell people, and show people where they can improve. Not just do all the fun stuff on the side. So it's been a journey. It's probably, I don't want to say it's not my favorite thing to do. I love when companies come to me and say, hey, can you help me prep for an internal, or can you help me do an internal and help me prep for an external audit? Because you have a lot more freedom. You're not so guidelined by the regulations. It's highly enforced on what we have to look at. And when a company hires you out with a government mandate, you have a lot more freedom to work with them on things that you think they should be working on, not things that the government tells them to work on. Here in the last couple of years, we've not been doing very well in the Gulf of Mexico on a safety record. Our safety incidents have significantly increased.
Where does that information come from? How is that?
From BSEE, the Bureau of Safety and Enforcement, offshore. So they keep up with that. The industry has a great relationship with BSEE. And so between the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement and groups like the Center for Offshore Safety, they do a really good job of letting the industry know what the statistics are. And our fatalities are up, our incidents are up. It's been a rough couple of years for the Gulf of Mexico. And one of the biggest things that I kind of personally think we need to do a better job of is, historically we tend to kind of say, oh, this incident happened. Okay, well, why did this incident happen? And we look at it and we come back with very generic answers of, and obviously I'm dumbing this down for the sake of an example. There was not a procedure. This person did not follow the procedure. And then we have a tendency to say, okay, well, we need to create procedure. We need to follow the procedure. And we tell everybody the procedure and we train everybody on the procedure. And that's kind of as far as we go. And what I really try and do with the operators that I'm working with is dig deeper, not just into after why incidents happen, but it's a good example of why. Okay, if this procedure existed and they knew that why did they not follow it? Well, they didn't know it was there. Well, why didn't they know it was there? Or they did follow, or they did know it was there, and a lot of it, and we know this is human nature. It comes back to humans. It comes back to safety, Kate. It comes back to human factors. It comes back to culture, and
Getting comfortable on the job.
getting comfortable. And it's something that's actually, I mean, it's not. I'm not saying anything that's new. This is not revolutionary. But it's actually in the Gulf of Mexico or offshore in general. I'm not even talking about the Gulf of Mexico. That's a hard job. That's a hard job.
Sure.
This is not a remote working, headphones in, kick your feet up, take your lunch break.
Hard mentally as well, because these men and women are away from their families for quite a while too.
Yes,
So it's
and
hard
the
in a lot of ways.
and the men and women that are working offshore, wherever in the world, it is not a culture of let's talk about how this feels.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think that we need to go all the way to where it sounds like I'm going with it, but we do need to look beyond, hey, let's add another piece of paper. Let's add another checklist to this. Let's create another tick box for these guys and girls to do. And okay, let's look at more of the leadership. Let's look at more of the aspects of why you wouldn't follow something. There's been a great study that just came out of Brazil, and I'm gonna kick myself for not being able to remember the guy's name, but he did this big study in offshore Brazil about the types of people that are willing to put themselves at risk. And it shows like guys that do certain jobs, like work on the drill floor, are a lot more comfortable with taking high risk. And we need to start really challenging that type of mentality of like, why are people really okay with taking such massive risks instead of just throwing another piece of paper in a checklist and being like, right, okay, here's another procedure that you've got to read. And so I'm in this kind of weird one foot. I do the auditing. I do a very kind of checklist based, government mandated type of job, but there's also a huge other aspect that I've been involved in years and I'm still, which is this kind of, how do we get people to think about the risk that they're taking offshore, and how do we challenge that? I think there's a correlation there, but I'm not sure if I figured it out yet.
Well, it sounds like it's you've got a plan that's evolving and it's coming together. I think you'll come with it. But I've got two questions, pointed questions. I want to come back to pretty much what you were just talking about. But
Mhm.
first question, because like I said, almost all of my interviews have been onshore. This is my first of anybody who works offshore, so it's a great thing for me because I would be learning as well. I have never been offshore. I don't know about anything about it. The greatest risk people look for, safety people look for, or scared of onshore, and I even took a poll on my own LinkedIn page the other day, is by far driving. That's the greatest risk in onshore. It poses threats in every different way possible, not only to their own workers, but to possible other people out there. So HSE managers that's by far they're what keeps them up at night, but also from their crush and blow injuries,
Mhm.
primarily to the hands. And in summertime now, especially down here, they're worried about heat injuries. There was a massive increase in heat injuries. No mystery why. It was a massive increase in heat
Yeah.
this past year. So those are things now heat obviously dealt with in the Gulf of Mexico as well, in addition to humidity, which makes it worse. But so offshore, how would you answer the question? What are the most critical things or risks that are on an offshore rig from the minute you step out there? What are some critical risks there?
I think line of fire is a huge one for us. I mean, we have so many crane operations going on. We have so many moving parts. Obviously, you have so many moving parts onshore, but you're so restricted by space. So your deck space is so limited that you're constantly moving these pieces of puzzles to try and get an operation done. So line of fire is so huge for us. And obviously, you've got working hands-on with the equipment, line of fire, your pinch points, your everything that comes with that. And then you've got so many moving parts, so many crane operations, so many parts that your body can get trapped between. So I would say line of fire is a huge one for us. And it's very difficult, I think, to sometimes correctly analyze the hazards beforehand because they're moving, they're fluid. You've got sea states, you've got wind states, you've got weather. Your deck didn't look the same as it did yesterday. So
Is that right? The actual configuration of the deck would change?
no, but where your Connex boxes are, where your setup, where your equipment has to move, you know, even the position of your supply vessels versus where which crane you're using to get to which deck to which. I mean, there's there's a lot of things that these men and women have to be paying attention to, and it's routine for them. Like in their mind, it's routine because they do it every day. But the hazards and the challenges are not routine. So that's a very difficult thing, and it's like driving. You drive the highway every day. It's just such a routine. We do it. But yet the dangers are still there, and the dangers are not going to be the same on one stretch of road than another stretch of road. So how do you challenge people to stay alert behind the wheel? How do you challenge people to stay alert in a small space that they live 14 and 14 or 28 and 28, and it's that challenge of analyzing the hazards that you think that you saw yesterday, but actually they've changed.
What are the typical like dimensions of a rig platform? What is
Oh gosh, Jeff, it's like kind of asking like how big is a boat? Like you can have these shelf platforms that are not large enough to land a helicopter on. Um and then you've got these 6th-gen drill ships that, I'd rather be on that than a Disney cruise. They really change. And this is also a challenge in the Gulf is.
I think a lot of people don't. I learned about. I didn't even know there was a such thing as drill ships till a couple years ago. If you're listening and you hadn't seen one of those, look that up. That is fascinating.
I will say that's really where I started. I've kind of gone. I went from drilling to being more on the drilling side, and now I do probably equal amounts on drilling versus production. Maybe now even more on production. So I really had to learn. Because if you start on a drill ship, you've gone the wrong direction. You need to work up to a drill ship.
Well, it looks to be like most people. Our visuals is the platform. Like we don't get to see drill ships, and that's what we get into movies and TV, right? And it looks to me like maybe 100 by 100 yards by 100 yards. So 100 is that 100 meters?
Jeff, you're gonna make me get my phone out and Google.
Oh, I guess I was just trying to wonder how. I mean, I guess
These 6th-gen drill ships are absolute monsters. Like
oh,
they're sizes of. I've never been on a cruise, but I imagine they they give a small cruise ship. Their POB, personnel is 220, 240 people on board. I mean, these are some
that was the question I was going to ask.
comfortable bad boys that are floating around the world right now. And then you go to a platform, and your POB is 6 people, and I have to kick somebody out of their bed when I come to stay. So it varies so much, which is also a personnel and task from like an HR standpoint. Is you can't always take somebody that's worked on a production facility in the shelf and expect them to be able to analyze the risks on a drill ship in super deep water.
Sure.
Same industry, inverted commas, but completely different hazards, different equipment, different operations.
So what would keep you up, as an advisor or consultant to someone offshore on the environmental side? Like what is the scare? What are the scares there? And I mean, are they using a lot of chemicals that if they got into the ocean where it's a disaster?
I want to say I think oil and gas gets, especially offshore, gets a really bad rap on the environmental side, and it has I want to say it has like almost a represent it has a kind of correlation of being under regulated
Mhm.
And it's not. On the environmental side, I do think Gulf of Mexico and offshore industry um, is highly regulated, and they do an excellent job. They are mandated to report every sheen, every the amount of government watching now, the technology that they have is unbelievable.
Yeah,
And
I've seen it.
operate well, if you know
Yeah.
better than anybody, but operators do not mess around. It's they're they're testing the level that they go to do reporting to is honestly, and because as an auditor, you sign these lengthy NDAs. You're not allowed to discuss. You have to see everything. You go offshore. You see everything. You
I've
get
signed NDAs
access.
before, see stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you get
But the
access to
technology is
everything that these guys are doing. You see everything that the operators are doing. You see everything that they're and they do it by the book. Um,
well, people, only going to sit, if BP Horizon, you only know that. We don't see
sure.
anything about the millions and millions of work hours and extraction coming from the ocean floor. We just see the one accident. And if you're a little bit older, I don't even think you're old enough to remember this, but the Exxon Valdez.
Oh, that was in my dissertation, yeah.
Yeah.
And the stuff that the Gulf of Mexico does for on the marine life is unbelievable because we've got these BOPs and these fantastic cameras in the depths of the ocean. Then we found new creatures, and we have to set up after the freeze, the big Houston had, or Texas had, this massive, massive freeze, and it did something. This just goes to show my level of intelligence, but it changed the water temperature so drastically that it really messed with turtles.
And it changes the water
It
temperature of the Gulf.
it changed something to do with, I don't know whether it's what they're eating, or it changed the way that turtles were now in the water. And like I sound like an idiot. But they went to the oil and gas companies and they said, "Guys, we need your help in order to help us track, th- the wildlife and what's happening." And oil and gas has a huge part to play in the health, in conservation, and the offshore environment of offshore, not just the negative environment, but also the positive environment.
I'm a diver myself, and I'm going to get off course a little bit here because it's fun subject. But I don't know. I haven't been there yet, but there's a place out in the Gulf where people go to dive, where the whale sharks come. If you've ever seen those,
Hmm.
they're they're not they're vegetarian, or they don't eat meat.
That's good
So
to know.
so you can be next to these unbelievably giant beasts, and you're in no danger of it eating you. And it's a pretty remarkable thing as a diver to be in like they're the size of whales. I mean they're whales. They're just what I mean by that, they're size of like blue whales. They're huge, and they'll swim right past you. But I think it's an abandoned platform, or one that's there, but you go out and there's just billions of types of fish. And the other thing I want to get at is, years ago, I wanted to mention this. Years ago, I was approached by a guy who, you think it's dangerous on the rig floor. There are people who work under the water
Oh
out
my
there.
gosh.
And so
Those guys, shout out to them. They are the
amazing.
craziest.
They do welding underwater.
So I did a water survival class with some of those, and I will say, after a couple years, a couple rounds of different water survival, the first time I did it, I loved it, and I was very young, and I thought I was great. And then I actually did one this year, and um, we've like I touched on, we've had a lot of drownings and a lot of fatalities in the Gulf of Mexico uh, in recent years, and unfortunately, a larger number of helicopter incidents than we should have. And I will say, water survival, last time I did it, whew, it was a mental struggle for me. I really struggled. But I've done it with those guys, and I don't know whether I love him in my class, or I almost want to purposefully kick him in the face when I'm trying to get out the helicopter, because it's just so easy because what they do for a living is so unbelievably mind-blowing
Yeah.
that you throw them in a swimming pool and they're like, this is a cakewalk. you're meant to hold your breath for a certain amount of time. And, 2 minutes later, these guys are still dilly-dallying about underwater in the pool just for a joke. Yeah, there's
Well, the thing, what they came to me for was this, and I got the phone call, met with a guy. He's like, I need a glove that will go up most of my arm. Um, I know you got cut-proof gloves, but I need something to protect from more of a puncture. And I went, what's the risk? That's what I always ask. What's the risk?
Mhm.
I think it's lionfish. Is it lionfish? There's a type of fish it's non-native to the Gulf of Mexico, but it was introduced out there, and they have I think it's lionfish. I may be wrong, but anybody anywhere near this water would know which one I'm talking about. It's a fish that they will sting you. And these guys were working underwater, and they were trying to use their hands, and they were getting stung on the hand. And it was pretty painful from what I understand. So they were looking for gloves. So their risk is even down to those types of risk, right? It's not a risk for your life, but I don't think it feels good.
How have I never heard of this? I'm
Look
gonna
up
go on a
it's li
deep Google dive.
if you look up lionfish in the Gulf, they bother the hell out of the guys who are working underwater to do those things, and that was it bothered them enough to come to us to ask for help. You know what kind of guys are doing this?
Yeah.
If it has
Yeah.
to be hell, or they wouldn't be asking for help.
Yeah.
So that was just a funny additional thing about the.
I mean, my favorite thing to do when I'm offshore and I get, a wee bit of time is you just go out on deck and you just look out on the water, and it's just on a clear day, the Gulf is like glass, and it's just
like the North Sea.
it's just like the North Sea. Yeah,
For those of you who don't know,
gray,
you do not want to be on a boat in the North
gray
Sea.
skies. Yeah,
It's rough.
yeah.
It's rough. Okay. Well, let me get to my next question. If I were an operator, how would you answer the question? What does your tell me? Well, I guess not elevator speech, but very extended elevator speech about what your company offers and why hiring you to help. What do you do for those companies? And rundown.
So, additional to obviously your government mandated audits that we can either do for you, or we can prepare you for, or we can, help you with your corrective actions, etc. We do provide a lot of operators with offshore personnel, and those are the people I pride myself on hiring. We're small, Jeff. Like, we're small. We've stayed small. Sometimes I think it was the worst business decision ever, but it's hard to grow when you're very particular on who you hire, and when somebody goes out and they work for you, that's your name, that's your brand. You understand that you're putting you're putting your name on it when you put it on somebody else. And it's people that are passionate about safety in the Gulf of Mexico. It's people that understand not just the regulations and, how to do things correctly, but what's the right way to do it. And so a lot of that comes from working inside the corporations and looking at how they do things. And a lot of that is providing good people that go offshore and that can work with people in the field. I do a lot of safety leadership courses, like give them, and it's not something that I really advertise that I do, but it ends up being something that I've done for a lot of operators, where you really try and challenge an organization to look at, okay, where do you want to make improvements, and how do we make meaningful improvements? And sometimes you've got to go to the field and you've got to get feedback and you've got to get buy-in. And, those are the things that we pride ourselves on doing really well. And as a company that only works in oil and gas, we understand oil and gas. And so there are a lot of people that do what we do, and more power to them. I'm sure they're financially a lot more successful. But they work in all kinds of industries. They're auditing automotives, they're auditing food, they're working in, safety in all facets of.
So Onward is 100% focused on energy.
Yes.
Okay. Very cool.
And look, I'm not going to shoot myself in the foot and say, one day would it be sensible? Would it be smart? Would it be savvy for me to move into other directions? Of course it would. But oil and gas is like, it's where our heart is. It's where our knowledge base is. We understand the struggles. We understand the challenges. And I think that's probably what gives us maybe a wee bit more of an edge, and it's not an area that I'm ashamed of. I know a lot of people are trying to stay away from the hydrocarbons, and I'm immensely proud of being somebody that is pro hydrocarbons, and I'm totally pro energy addition, but
We were, yeah, that's
energy
funny.
addition.
We were there together that night.
I like
We
energy
invented that. Yeah,
addition.
it was what did that lady say? It was
Evelyn McLean said it. I prefer to say energy addition rather than energy transition.
yeah.
And
And I was like, yes.
yes,
That's it. That's more the way to approach it because you're not getting rid of. There's no way. I mean, there's I forget the guy's name is off the top of my head because I'm doing this, but there's a guy out there who's a huge advocate for oil and gas, and he's constantly says, and anybody that does, the price of quitting hydrocarbons is much, much, much higher than the price of having it.
yeah,
The human toll. One thing that was discussed earlier is natural gas and fertilizer. How do you feed people without that? It has to have it. So it's important, and people have, there's going to be a segment of the population out there that have fallen off the deep end on the energy, and you're not going to rescue them back, and you're not going to talk some sense into them. But there's people in the middle who have been inundated with propaganda, who I think we can bring off the ledge and say, hey, look, this is going to be, sure, we're going to add some things, but this is going to be important for still the next 30 to 50 years still. I mean, it's not going away anytime soon. So the environmental and safety side is hugely important because that microscope is on the energy industry. So you helping people to avoid, of course we want to avoid things like Deepwater Horizon because that makes, hell, they even made a movie about it.
yeah,
I mean, so that's a big deal. But the other thing is, the deaths, the injuries, the helicopter, things like that. That's detrimental to companies in every way possible. But one thing you mentioned about teaching safety leadership, of all the things that I've learned and going around, and this is my life, safety is that, how do you get a leadership culture, or how do you get a safety culture? And that's by far number one. It's about the guy on top, and the guy I use an example of is Marshall Dodson from Key Energy. The dude is about safety, and his company shows it, and he preaches it like no other. And so the leadership has to, if that's the minimum. If leadership isn't 100% on board, isn't preaching this thing like it's the Bible every single day, the company won't live in that, because like you said, the guys and and the ladies as well out there, they're the same type of people. They're risk averse, and they're crazy brave. And so crazy brave tends to but can get in trouble. So you have to find a way to manage that. And, that was even a thing in the military, is to manage someone brave, but also to make them be cautious in the right way. And so I'm sure that's the same thing on this floor. But that's interesting to get your point of view on that, because that's, to me, I agree with that. But I think it transcends across the energy industry as far as the leadership being the primary point. One thing too, I do like to end these things, these interviews, is I like to ask people, and at the end I'll get you to tell how people can get in contact with you and learn more about your company as well. But I like to ask people personally what's important to them. This happened. This is a tradition on my podcast. Happened as an accident on my second podcast with David Reed, and I had learned a little bit about him, and I learned he was involved in human trafficking. And if you've been anywhere within 1,000 miles of me over the last 2 years, I'm involved in that now, and it came from David. So I like to ask people, what's important to them personally. I know you're married. I know we've talked about what's important to you personally, and so tell us a little bit about what you do outside of work and what your passions are.
So I spend a lot of time, and I did it in Scotland. I was a child advocate in Scotland. And then when I came over to Houston, I kind of got sucked into that live to work, and it made me take a step back, especially when you come over and you're on your own, and your work is your only anchor. And anyway, I'm trained to be a child advocate in Houston for Harris County. And so what I've done for the last 9 years is you go into foster homes or the homes of children, group homes or whatever, and you have a child, you were given a child by the Harris County courts that's within the foster system, and you advocate for their rights in court and out of court. Everything from health needs to dental needs to checking in on them in their foster home, and then going to court and asking for any additional help that you need. I've been doing that for about 9 years, and I think the foster system in the US is incredibly broken. I think the foster system, especially in Houston, is so overrun, so overwhelmed, and we're very harsh in the US. There's lots of great things, but we expect so much of somebody when they turn 18. There's not a lot of help after that age. And we expect people and we judge people pretty harshly when they're not kind of productive members of society. But there is so little help for kids that do not already have a support system. And so we kind of abandon kids in the foster system, and we abandon them even more so when they turn to an adult. And yet we expect a lot of people when they turn into adults. And so I think it's important. Obviously, I've got that legal side, which does great in the courts and working with judges, and I kind of feel like I'm good in that sense. And it's tough. You see a lot of abuse, you see a lot of neglect. You have to read through their case studies, and you have to get to know the kid, and you have to get to know often, sometimes their abuser, or it's
That's an incredibly difficult thing to face.
it's and it also helps me though, Jeff, like it really helps me put into perspective as somebody that loves what I do for work. I'm obviously very passionate about my work and the company, but it does help kind of balance things and get things into perspective sometimes. Um, and I think that's really important for me. I will say I've started working with another group out of Houston called the Hay Center, which is Houston, stands for Houston Alumni Youth. And they specialize in helping teenagers transition out of foster care. Because in 2021, I actually had a teenager that I was guardian ad litem for 4 years, and she passed away as a result of the neglect and abuse. And that's a very difficult thing. You're thinking, we're the third largest city in the US now, and we are rich and wealthy in so many aspects. But so many of what things are being done to and what children are going through in this city is just truly unfathomable. And so I started working with the Hay Center because it particularly shone a light on the lack of help that teenagers in particular are getting. Um,
Well, what is it? So, as an advocate, is that is that an organization or is that a?
so child advocacy is an organization, but the rights are given by the judge. So the judge will decide which cases get a child advocate, and the
So this
judge
works
will
for the
assign
government, though.
you. You work with it's an independent it's an independent charity, like a 501c3 charity. But they have the backing of the Harris County judges. They're everywhere. They're all across America. But it does have a big impact because the judge assigns you your case and says, "Hey, this case needs a child
Can you give the name
advocate."
of that or no? Is that private?
Oh no, it's CASA. It's child advocate. If you Google child advocates, it's a
That's
multinational, or not multinational. It's a national organization, and every section kind of has theirs. Like San Antonio has theirs, Dallas has a child advocate.
so it sounds something you said. It sounds like you believe that obviously we fail a lot and we don't do very well with the foster care system, but it seems like we're failing them. Or there needs to be some sort of mentorship program into adulthood. Like there's a lot of things people deal with at 18 that if you don't, I've told people as far as my mindfulness training, and I've told people who are blessed to have two parents who prepared them for life, to not look harshly upon people who did not, because
Yes.
they are turning 18 and 19 without an ounce of guidance.
Yep.
And so that hurts them and that puts them behind the eight ball. But it sounds like, everybody knows about Big Brother, Big Sister. Well, that's for little children, but there is no, I'm not aware of any.
So the Hay
mentor.
Center.
That's
So
what they do.
this is what the Hay Center does, because so Child Advocate deals with kids of all ages, and I felt like there was this huge gap for teenagers who are they're going through a lot already, and then these kids, a lot of them have never had a stable home. They've lived out of a
Trauma.
trash bag for their entire lives. They've gone through a lot of trauma. They've gone through things that we cannot even fathom as functioning adults. And so I will say the Hay Center, Houston Alumni Youth, and I'm sure there's equivalents all over. And yeah, they specialize in that transition age of kind of 15 to 18 up to kind of 20, and they help. So I'm a mentor with them as well, and yeah, you help figure out their job situation and how to interview and just be there for financial planning and all the stuff that we had our parents for, but they don't have anybody.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's wonderful. I really, I think most people, rightly so, by our compassionate minds, look for younger children and to help. But we can't. It's a great point to say we can't forget children who are still trying to become an excellent adult, despite the trauma, despite the problems, despite the difficulties as children. You can become an excellent adult. I've interviewed them.
Yeah.
I've interviewed them, and so you can. It's just you need help. You need some guidance. So that's great that the Hay group or
Hay Center.
Hay
Yep.
Center is doing that type of work. So you can obviously look them up online, find out a little bit about that if that's something you want to be involved in, and obviously. Nina described being a child advocate very well. So if that's something that you're listening and that may spark you, go for it. That's something you can get involved with and do. It sounds like a pretty intensely responsible job there, as opposed to most working with charities. But that's good. We need people doing it though. So that's a wonderful thing that you did. About you, where can people find out more information on Onward Inc.?
So I will give you the websites. We're www.crewanward.com, and we're onwardauditing.com. LinkedIn I'm active on, but struggle with everything else. As a typical millennial, I've just fallen off the social media train. But yeah.
Yeah, I do think older people are more involved in social media than
I
30-somethings.
swear.
It's kind of that way. It's like, oh my God, how can we can communicate with people we haven't seen in 30 years? Yes, you can. Well, wonderful. And so you're on LinkedIn. They can find out, you can follow Nina on LinkedIn as well in her professional journey. And this was my first interview with someone from the offshore. I was excited about it. We met a while back at the British American Business Council.
Yep.
British American Business Council as you were moderating that, and it was a wonderful night. And so we and you, in addition to what you're doing, you're also involved in the Red M group. You do those things as well. So you can often find Nina in those events as well. So, but thank you very much for sharing that things you do, and also the professional side, the offshore safety and environmental world, which is a complicated one. And glad to see you're doing it, and glad to see Onward is doing it. And thank you so much for coming to talk about it.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. It's been fun.
Yeah, you have a wonderful rest of your day and a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show and accept the mission. Please subscribe to the Mission Zero podcast on your preferred streaming service, and be sure to give us a 5-star review.